Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fisherman's Post Saltwater Podcast Series. This episode is titled Kayak Fishing for Trophy Red Drum. I'm going to be talking with Rod Olsen of Toadfish Mafia out of Carteret County, and we're going to be hitting on such topics as location, gear, baits versus artificials, as well as safety considerations. I'm your host, Gary Hurley of Fisherman's Post. Fisherman's Post has been serving the saltwater fishing community since 2003. We've been bringing you fishing reports, fishing information, fishing tournaments, fishing schools, member content, and here in our latest and greatest chapter, the Saltwater Podcast Series, where we reach out to our captain and guide friends from up and down the North Carolina coast and ask them to share with us their insights, their thoughts, their knowledge on how to catch more fish more often. In this endeavor, I am now joined by my podcast partner, David Harden of Harden Creative Media. Welcome to yet another episode, David Harden.
Hello, Gary Hurley.
Yeah, man. I always say it, but it's true. Feels good to be in the podcast.
It does. Ready to talk some fishing?
Yeah, and I'll admit out front, kayak fishing is a little bit out of my comfort zone. I don't have that much experience.
Yeah, same. I've been in a kayak. That's about as close to it. I have fished on a paddleboard.
All right.
So that's sort of, I don't know if it's similar. We'll find out if it's similar, I guess.
I bet you he addresses it now because he's hearing us set up the show. And yeah, man, I mean, I've fished in a kayak. I've been in a kayak, but it isn't my go-to. And so, I mean, I know they have those things tricked out and I know they're efficient and, not just efficient kayak, but what they do and how they do it. So I'm very much looking for this conversation with Rod Olsen. First met it this past year at the Moorhead Saltwater Fishing School. But before we get to Rod, we got some business.
We do. We have some sponsors to thank. The first sponsor of the podcast is Port City Signs and Graphics.
Sabrina and crew. I hope we're doing a good job of branding those guys out there. Primarily work with business, but certainly they are, they will take personal business as well, but mainly a business outfit. And as I say every time, man, they do every sign for Fisherman's Post, feather flags, pole flags, all of it, leaderboard logos, hanging banners. Love the team at Port City Signs and Graphics. Reach out to them, visit their website, see what they can do for you.
That's right. So you want to see if you can identify a Port City Signs and Graphics sign?
I feel pretty confident I can.
Okay, I'm going to show you two signs. One of them is made by Port City Signs and Graphics. The other one is not made by Port City Signs and Graphics. Are you ready?
I understand the rules of the game.
Okay, here's sign number one. It's a large sign that says now open. Underneath it says closed.
I don't think that's Port City Signs, but I retain my right to see sign number two before making a ruling.
Okay, let's look at sign number two. Oh, sign number two is a illuminated UNCW sign. Looks like it's in a lounge of some kind, maybe an athletic lounge for UNCW. It's a very nice sign.
That is one, I'll say, look, UNCW represents big money, and they're spending their money with Port City Signs and Graphics too. Yeah, maybe I need a sign like that here in the Fish Post office.
That would look really good
here in the podcast studio.
That's right. That
exists a couple days a month.
Yeah, that's kind of thing that would be well worth it.
Well, right on. Thank you, Sabrina and crew.
Sure. Also, thanks to our next sponsors, Marine Warehouse Center.
Sales, service, and parts. I want to just plug those guys, man. They take care of the Fish Post boat, and I know they'll take care of your boat. Love my friends at Marine Warehouse Center. Emmett, Terrell, Joel. I could laundry list names, man.
And we've got a video.
I'm so ready.
Excited to give you guys a huge update. We're now carrying Seabourn and Spider boat line. Of course, we have the newest models of Carolina Skiff, Sailfish, Sea Chaser, and Pan Marine. With over 60 boats in stock at a Wilmington location, let's schedule a sea trial and let's get you on the water today.
Yeah, Port City Signs and Graphics, Marine Warehouse Center, two great sponsors we've got.
We do. That is part of the joy. I do business with both of them, so it's easy for me to plug them. I'm not getting, I guess I'm getting paid to plug them, but I would plug them anyway. I do, man. They take care of me. Both of them take care of me in different ways.
Good group of folks.
And if you would like to be a sponsor, David Harden.
Yes, you just call the Fisherman's Post office and we will set you in the right direction.
Yeah, and I also am continuing to remind people that if you're a fan of the podcast and you want more podcasts, then we now offer podcast benefits for members. You can get early access to all podcasts 1 week before the public release. And we also now feature a bonus podcast content bit. It's usually 10 to 15 minutes where we continue our conversation with the guest. And that continuation of the conversation isn't made publicly. It's only available behind the paid wall. And that membership also includes our weekly fishing reports. It includes our More Fish video library. Go to the website for more details. We'd love to have you join. We'd love to have you support our efforts here. But right now, it's time to bring out Rod Olsen of Toadfish Mafia and David Harden. You know the deal, man. You've done.
That's right. I'm taking notes.
You've done enough of these to know that we end with David's best takeaway.
That's right. I'll be ready for it.
All right. Well, let's not wait. Let's bring out Rod Olsen, Toadfish Mafia out of Carteret Community College, Carteret County. I teach at Cape Fear. I think that's why I got community college on the brain. So we got Rod Olsen, Toadfish Mafia, Carteret County. Man, before we talk about kayak fishing for trophy red drum, every guest has to go through the 2 questions. You tell me you're ready for 2 questions. I give you question number 1.
Go for it. Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Question number 1, Rod Olsen, is why should David, why should anyone listen to you talk about either kayak fishing or red drum fishing? Give me a why.
Well, I can sum it up as one primary takeaway. There's several reasons in my mind, but the one that really jumps out is if there's a way to do it wrong, I've probably done it. So having gone through and done that so many times, I can tell you now that finding success and now getting that success has made it to where I feel very confident on the water. I've got years of experience now, and I like to share that information with folks. I don't guide as a captain or anything. I just fish for the passion of it. I like sharing that information.
Man, I got to say, David, that is a good answer that Rod Olsen just gave.
That was great.
I really like that.
I was looking at the background of the Toadfish Mafia gear he's got there. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, he's smart. He's plugging and he's answering questions successfully. And you are moved successfully on to question number 2. You tell me you're ready. I give you question number 2.
Let's go for it.
All right. Question number 2 is trivia based, and it's inspired by Toadfish Mafia. My question to you is how many times, and I'm going to give you within 2, I'm going to give you a buffer, 2 up or 2 low. How many times was the word mafia said in the 1972 movie, The Godfather?
Ooh. It's been a long time since I've seen that movie.
It's a trick question.
I was about to say, I don't remember hearing it. So I'm trying to think, is it between 0 and 2? I don't know.
It's 0. The word mafia was never said. In fact, that was, I think, part of the relationship, part of the agreement with the mafia is that they could make the movie with their blessing and employees would show up and strikes wouldn't happen as long as they didn't say the word mafia out loud. So there we go. We're done with our trivia. We're done with our 2 questions. You passed brilliantly. And let's go on. And again, I don't know about kayak fishing like I maybe know about other areas. And, we're talking about kayak fishing for big reds, for trophy reds. So I guess you have me somewhere in the Neuse, the Pamlico Sound, the Pamlico River. And I'm guessing that location is pretty important because you got to be able to put that kayak in and you got to be at a place where you can actually access fishable grounds. So help our audience.
Absolutely. You're exactly right. The redfish season, the big trophy redfish season really kicks off in August and September. So the end of August is a really good time to get out and get fishing for them. You can catch them all the way in the Pamlico Sound and then all the way up the lower Neuse River, up even past the Minnesota Ferry area. So some areas there where you can get some shore that you can actually launch from. But the decision is really going to come down to what kind of kayak you use. If you've got a small kayak that you can just chuck into a ditch and move out into the water, then you can probably launch from a bunch of random little areas fairly successfully. But if you have a bigger kayak, a heavier kayak, or a very stable fishing kayak, then you need to plot your spots a little bit better. You have to be able to pick a boat ramp or an area that's got some really good structure on the edge of the actual river itself where you can launch successfully and get out to those spots. And it really comes down to how you're going to get there. If you're going to have to paddle it, it's going to be a big challenge. But if you have the more advanced kayaks that have pedals or trolling motors, then the ability to get that range to get to where the fish will be are pretty key. And a lot of that comes down to finding the right locations. For me, I target the shoals heavily. There's going to be shoals in between 4 foot to 15 foot range where you see the drop offs and ledges. But these fish will run up to 20 miles a day. and you're just trying to get into that pattern. You're trying to be in the road as they're coming by. So those ledges are a good way to kind of funnel the fish. So I try to go up, launch from an area that I can get to a shoal with a reasonable amount of time, get set up in those areas, and start fishing from there.
All right. So I already have a list of questions that come to mind. And again, I think part of my job as host is to sort of hit you up for information, usable information for someone watching this podcast and looking for that help. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I would say, and I'm going to say up front, I never asked this question. I don't think of any other guest, inshore guest. So would you be willing to share one place that you like to put in that gives you pretty good access to red drum grounds? And I hate asking you for a specific, I won't ask you like a specific ledge or a specific, but at least, because then I want to know like how far of a paddle or how far of a pedal. It'll just start the conversation, I think.
For sure. I think the one place that I would say if you were starting out, I want to go put in and take my kayak to go chase and try to get a trophy red drum, I would probably launch around Dawson's Creek. Just outside of Oriental. There's a boat ramp there, and there's some side shoaling there you can launch from, run under the bridge, and then as you come out and head downriver, there's some shoals right there as you first come out. So you can start fishing pretty early. Now, I would continue to move on and around and definitely either chase bait balls or look for those ledges if I'm going to soak baits. But you can get started fairly quickly from that location. There are other places you can go, but if you do those, you're probably going to have to cover a little more range.
So no one would do that without looking at a map, and I'm sure many are familiar with Dawson's Creek just by name and know what you're talking about. But again, just to help set the stage. So if you're putting in at Dawson's Creek, how far do you expect to paddle or pedal before you start efforts? I get that you're moving around. I get it's not a singular destination, but for someone trying to visualize, is this doable for me? Then you would advise them, well, be prepared to cover at least blank.
I would say if you're going to launch from the boat ramp, if you have a heavier kayak, like I fish Old Town autopilots. So I have an autopilot 120 and an autopilot 136. They both have trolling motors. So my range is only limited by my battery and how much I'm willing to paddle back if I have a malfunction. So I would launch from the boat ramp and run out and around. And it'll probably take me 20 minutes running under the trolling motor power to get there. But if I had to pedal or paddle it, I would launch from the shore side next to where the bridge is on Dawson's Creek there. And then the distance from there out, you're talking half a mile max.
All right. And then, so there's all kinds of places. Is there a resource? Like what are the kayak resources where someone can go online and it helps guide them to kayak friendly ports?
I actually use a couple different options. One of the things I look at, I use Google Earth and Google Maps constantly, just looking at for area and terrain to try to see, okay, is there an area I can get to? Does it have the kind of bottom or the area next to where the river edge is that I can potentially get my kayak close enough to it? Because it's heavy enough, I can carry it on a cart. So I can drag it down and launch it that way, but it's easier to launch from a boat ramp. But it's kind of the way I kind of scout around. But if I'm really looking to try to get a quick, easy, like I want to go fishing tomorrow, I don't have time to do a bunch of research, then one of the first places I go to are the Facebook groups for kayak fishing all over the internet. There's several fishing groups based in Eastern North Carolina, including ones that focus entirely on kayak fishing. And those folks are all really helpful. I started out fishing on a boat for years, and then as I started getting into kayak fishing, I've just jumped in with both feet, and I do that, I won't say exclusively, but that's my go-to. If I can go out on the kayak, I will. And if I can't, then I'll go out on the boat. And in doing that, what I've learned is that the kayak fishing community is very well knit, very friendly. Everybody I know that fishes on a kayak is really talkative, really helpful. So those folks, if you're like, hey, I'm looking to get into these fish, I want to take my son out or my family out and go try to find, we have a couple, this is the kind of kayak we have. We want to get to this area or somewhere just to find a fish. What can we do? And those groups tend to be very, very helpful. And they provide their experience. They have spots that they found along the way that have worked well. And I've even learned a few things from being a part of that group or those kinds of groups. And we also, in the Toadfish Mafia, joined those groups and try to be part of that information resource.
Man, all right. I'm smiling already. I mean, I'm a fan of community right now. I mean, maybe it says I'm getting older or further along in my fish post career, but community does it for me. And I can see that in the kayak fishing community. That's fantastic. So now let's change the conversation away from accessibility and porting to the types of locations you like to start either looking for fish or looking for bait pods, or what does it look like in mid to late August when you go out? What is it that you're looking for or what have you seen before that you're trying to return to?
A lot of what I'm looking for is ledges, but the delineation is going to be what the weather's doing. If I'm launching out and the wind is blowing really good, then it's going to be hard to find the bait balls. Even if I have an idea where they should be, they obviously move around. So I'll look for the ledges and where the fish will feed in the shallows, and then the ledges themselves become that highway I was talking about. So I'll kind of head that direction, and if the wind isn't blowing like crazy, then I'll look for those bait balls and then try to target them if I can see some. And if it's flat enough, you can see them a good ways on the horizon, which is great. And if I see them, then I'll go creep up on them and try to fish them. But if I get out there and I don't see any bait balls anywhere, then what I'll go looking for are the really good drop-off ledges. So I use my GPS chart plotter that I have mounted on my kayaks. I use the Garmin units, and I run out and I'll look using the contours on the map and try to find where the contour lines get really tight together. It shows a really strong drop-off. I'll come up there and look for something that starts out, like I said, about 4 foot of water and have really tight contours next to it. That's the kind of area I would set up and try soaking maybe some cut bait to see if I can find something that's coming through when I just can't seem to find any actual active bait balls running around me. So those ledges and those shallows are kind of key.
So is then a Garmin key, is electronics key, like for the guy that doesn't have electronics on the boat, how's he going to play that game?
That's where the early planning comes in. You don't have to know exactly where all those ledges are. You just kind of want to be in the area. If you can look that up on Google Earth or Google Maps, I like Google Earth on the computer because you can look at old photography from years prior, and so you can see different images at different wind conditions and tide levels depending on where you're fishing, and you can see where the shoals tend to be. And then if you can find a reference maybe on the shore or a rough distance, you can kind of figure out, okay, somewhere in this general area, I'm going to come out from under a bridge and I'm going to turn left and go what I'll assume to be maybe a half a mile, and then I'll start trying to fish. That's still going to be in the area. It may not be exactly on the ledge, which may be like you could call it maybe a hot spot per se, but if you're generally in the area, then you'll start to find either more bait come through, or you'll start seeing those, if you start putting bait out, you have the potential of catching those migratory fish. So that's kind of key to me, is to go find the general area as best you can. If you don't have the fancy electronics, then at least have a rough order with the prep the night before.
I have another question. I hope I'm not showing my kayak ignorance already with these questions. But I forget whether you said you were fishing from a boat and then switched over to kayak and jumped in 2 feet. So for me, I notice when I'm with a captain, they're much better at seeing pogies than I am. I mean, sometimes they're obvious, but they're much better than me. I mean, they're on the water every day. And I'm up higher and he's up higher. So now you're down lower. So did you find that there was a pretty big learning curve where all of a sudden it's like a much more challenge to see them and you have to refine your skills? Or I guess I'm trying to figure out how tough it's going to be. I know that every day is different.
Well, it really depends on conditions. I've noticed that while I'm sitting down, as I'm moving out on the kayak, if a bait ball is being disturbed, if something has got them sketchy or they're really uncomfortable, they'll still put enough ripples in the water that if you're familiar with looking for them, you'll be able to see them pretty well. If it's calm enough and nothing's really spooked the bait, that's when they become a lot harder to see. And I've found myself on the kayak rolling up into a bait ball because the kayaks themselves are generally quieter than boats. You can get a whole lot closer than you may even intend to. I've actually took the kayak up and then looking in the water next to me, be surprised that, oh, there's bait there. And I'll try to kind of get away from it and kind of follow it along from there. So it does take that time on the water to really go find the bait, see how it reacts, see what to expect with the ripples and the pops as they really start feeding or getting fed on. And so that experience helps out a ton. From that, the perspective from being low or standing up isn't as big a deal, but definitely being up higher is definitely easier to see, for sure.
So I just had my question. I was actually writing down something else as you were saying that, and I just had my question, but now I can't think of. Oh, I know what it was. And maybe you would talk about this at the end in safety considerations. Barring anything unexpected popping up storm-wise, but do you have in your mind, what is a comfortable wind? What is a comfortable wave for you to, chop for you to fish? And then, what might you sort of, again, suggest to someone that isn't Toadfish Mafia, but isn't beginner, maybe intermediate, what's the numbers that they need to start asking themselves? I'm not sure this is a good idea.
That's a great question. It's very important to understand what the conditions are going to be like in the water you'll be fishing. The Pamlico Sound in the open areas, it doesn't take a lot of wind to get very, very nasty out there. So I would say for those open areas or anywhere that's open to the wind, I don't like fishing anything more than maybe 10 miles an hour max. If it's going 10 to 15, you start getting white caps, the chop starts to get thick, and then you're already going to be bouncing around on the kayak. And if you happen to hook up and are fighting a big, heavy fish, things can go wrong really bad, really quickly. So I tend to fish, if I'm going to be in the open area, I try to fish at least single-digit winds if I can. And then if I'm in an area that's more confined, then maybe 15, maybe 20 miles an hour. Anything over 20, I'm not bothering with it at all, especially on the kayaks, even if it's fairly protected.
Yeah, man, and I think it's understood that everyone has their own comfort level, but I was wondering, how you would advise or how you approach it. And that sounded like a very, I like specifics, and that was a pretty specific answer. The next talking point we had was gear, and I'm just going to guess that you probably have about $25,000 into your kayak because of how kayak fishermen are. I mean, maybe 23, but we'll just whatever. Tell me about some of the gear that you have in general or that you have specific when you're doing trophy reds. Like, what do you think is a must on the boat? What do you say is recommended on the boat? The kayak.
I would say a fishing kayak to me is a really big deal because you want to have something that's large enough and stable enough to deal with the conditions that you're going to be in. Those are really big fish, and when you try to land that big fish, if you're in a kayak that you're kind of wobbly on in a good day on flat water, trying to manhandle that massive fish to try to get your picture is going to be a real big pain in a real dangerous situation potentially. You don't want to get dumped over in this water. There are bull sharks and alligators and jellyfish. I don't want anything to mess with those things. The stingrays, you're going to do a bunch of stingrays everywhere too. Don't forget those. So my plan is to stay in the kayak as best as possible, and I find that a stable, wide kayak, it doesn't have to be multi-$1,000s, but at least something stable enough that I feel like it can take a little bit of tippingness and can take the waves and can deal with if you're having to fight this fish and you're having to deal with some stuff, trying to grab a net or some fish grips or whatever it is you're trying to land it with. That's going to be super helpful. That's like my starting point. So at least a decent kayak. I wouldn't go down to Walmart and grab the simplest kayak they've got, go chuck that in the water and try to chase this large a fish. You can absolutely kayak fish those kayaks, and there's no problem in that, in the right conditions, chasing the right species. But for these big old fish, I mean, they are massive fish. We see pictures of them online. It's amazing to see how big they can get. I mean, you're talking 50, 60-pound fish sometimes, at least 50 inches long in a few cases. I mean, anything over trophy red is 40 inches and above. And this time of year, you can catch several of those fish. It's just unbelievable. So that's the number one for me, especially from a kayak perspective. You want at least a stable kayak within reason.
Makes sense.
The second thing I think is really kind of a must is you got to have a rod that's got some backbone to it and a reel that's got enough line and a really good drag system. So it doesn't have to be a $500 reel, but I wouldn't go grab the Shakespeare standard Walmart knockoff in this condition. You can fish from shore with that, catch a bull drum and land it probably fine without any real issues. But if I'm on the kayak and I hook into one of these fish and they start screaming drag and I'm trying to deal with the rest of the chaos of getting my anchor up if I'm anchored or raise my power pole or pull in another line if I was soaking baits and putting that rod away while dealing with this other fish, I don't want to have to worry about the drag or that rod not being able to do what it needs to do. So as it's peeling out, you want a nice smooth drag, and there's kind of a price point, probably about $100 minimum, maybe the $150 range, where you start getting quality drags that are carbon-based, that you get a nice smooth drag payout as the drag starts to release. And to me, that's kind of the starting point. If you've got that, you're good. You can get fancier and lighter and all that. That's all great. But I would start out with probably something in the 3500 series, maybe about the minimum, and work up to maybe a 5000 series. You can go larger, but on a kayak, you don't want to get too big. So what I fish are 3500 series reels, and I put those on a 7-foot, 7.5 foot medium heavy or heavy rod with a fast tip action.
All right, braid pound, and then again, I want to be impressed by what's on the kayak itself. I mean, what you're talking about in essential information, but you even got a reaction out of both Dave and I off screen when you said power pole, because we're like, man, yeah, a kayak with a power pole.
Okay. So yeah, that's a good point. So braid, I usually use 30-pound braid to start, and I put a 50-pound mono leader, just mono. I don't find any benefit in fluorocarbon, especially in the tannin water of the noose. So that's what all of mine are rigged up with when I'm fishing for these fish. For the kayak itself, for me, I'm all about comfort. And I won't lie, you're correct. It's not $23,000, but it is thousands of dollars. My autopilot 120, actually the 120 and the 136 are rigged out very similarly. So I have a 7-inch side scan GPS sonar on it. There's a trolling motor built into the bow. The old town autopilots come with the built-in trolling motor. It's a 45-pound thrust trolling motor. And then on the back of the unit, I have PowerPole makes what's called a micro anchor, which basically takes like a stakeout stick and runs it through this unit with a battery attached, or you can run it into the main battery that will actually pin your kayak automatically. And I love that because I have a little command center kind of built on my kayak to my left that has the display for the GPS, and below it, it has the little buttons like you'd have on your dash for your boat to raise and lower that power pole. So as soon as I hook up, if I want to stop where I'm at, I'll just double tap the down button and the pole goes down behind me, automatically stops the kayak from moving, and I can continue to fight the fish. I love that part.
I bet. I mean, that sounds intriguing. I've never kayak fished like that. That does sound intriguing. Of those three items, I mean, just for some context, and again, I'm challenged to ask these questions. What would be most important, the electronics, the trolling motor, or the power pole?
For me, it really comes down to the trolling motor just because of the kind of area I want to cover. If you're in really good shape, then you can pedal kayak for miles. I am not in really good shape. Therefore, I will not be pedaling that far. But having that trolling motor to get the distance that I want to get to the fish, I think is probably number one, because you never know where these fish are going to be, and you may plot out an area you want to reach. And if that's all the range you've got that day, then it can be a short trip if you get out there and they're just not in the right region. But by having that range that comes with that trolling motor, I can get to the other side of the river if I want to, or I can run way up or way down and actually try to find fish a lot longer if the conditions are allowing it. The electronics are nice. It's easier to find ledges, and you can find bait balls that aren't popping on the surface. So that I enjoy that aspect of it, or finding structure in the water when you do the side scanning as you're moving around. But you absolutely don't need that. There's days I forgot my head unit for the GPS at home, and I've still caught fish. It's just not as convenient. And then for the power pole, that's just lazy. I love it. It's super easy. You can do it manually if you need to, but it's limited because you have to be in a certain depth. So if you're in 8 or 9 foot of water, it's just barely catching. If it's muddy, it doesn't hold as well. So you can do the same thing with a $20 claw anchor and a rope. So.
All right, I'm only going to belabor gear with one more question, and then we're going to go to baits versus artificial. So my last gear question, and certainly aren't looking for you to laundry list everything that you put on your kayak, but as far as like a smaller accessory, like a hack or just something that you found to be invaluable that maybe everyone else hasn't thought of. I think about back to my camping days. You're always looking for sort of a better system or a better piece of equipment. What do you got, man? What would make the list of here's a small thing, but it can make a big difference?
Well, I'll tell you, the solution that I saw, I can't take credit for it because it was one of my fishing buddies. He actually came up with it, is that for trolling and for fishing, when you're doing any kind of heavy bait fishing and you're using a big heavy rod like you would for these bull drum, instead of using the plastic rail style fishing rod holders, which we still use those, but we don't use those for those heavy fish. What he did is he picked up the metallic rail mount fishing rod holders like you put on a boat, and he mounts them to his seat. So they sit underneath both of his legs, and he can put the fishing poles on both sides of his legs while he's either trolling or sitting anchoring. They're right there next to him, and they're fixed to his seat rails, which are much stronger than the actual plastic rails in the kayaks. And it blows me away. He can get hung up, and his kayak will turn all around, and those rod holders never give way at all. They're super strong. And he's the only person that I've seen of all the kayaks I've seen online and in person. He's the only one I've seen use those rod holders, and they work fantastic. The only reason I don't use them is because the same place he has where they're located, I have a tackle bag that sits basically between my legs because it's easy for me to grab it in a hurry in front of me rather than reaching around behind. It goes back to that lazy side.
All right, let's go. I mean, I'm glad I asked that. I love, when people come up with clever solutions. So the next question, I guess, instead of just saying, hey, let's talk about baits versus artificials, I guess I could either say, which do you prefer? And we'll start there. Or maybe the better question is, again, I'm thinking of the not beginner, but the intermediate or beginner to intermediate. what would you suggest be their entry into trophy red drum fishing from the kayak?
Well, a lot of it comes down to conditions. If the wind isn't blowing really, really hard, then popping cork and form is really hard, which is like the number one go-to for kayak fishing. I mean, folks use popping corks, not kayak fishing, for trophy drum fishing. Even out of a boat during the day, popping corks is normally where it's at. But there's a skill set to that. So to me, if you're getting into trophy drum fishing and you got a little bit of familiarity, but you may not know exactly how to throw the popping cork and get it to work just the way you want to catch the fish but not spook the fish, then the bait fishing works. The only downside of the bait fishing side is it's not very active. I mean, you do have to check your baits for bait stealers, and you do want to be in the bait stealers when you're actually fishing cut bait or blue crabs or whatever you're using, so they don't steal your bait off the hook and you're fishing on credit. But that's overall, that level of effort is not as engaging. And on a hot day in the sun, in the middle of the river, with lines just sitting there soaking, that can get a little boring. So it really comes down to playing what cards you're dealt. So if the wind's reasonable, then I would definitely pop and cork if I can, or if I'm familiar, and take the time to practice with it. If not, then if it's really rough and bouncy, then soaking baits can still catch fish, even though the pop and cork, they can't see it or hear it.
All right, tell me how you like to rig up a pop and cork rig. What's the terminal tackle for you?
My favorite pop and cork overall is the blabbermouth. It's a big, loud, obnoxious pop and cork, and I actually have one, figuring that most people know what they look like, but I figured I would bring one out. So you can probably hear it in the microwave, or excuse me, in the microphone. So really obnoxious. So I tie this to the 50-pound leader on the rod itself, and then I use basically 80-pound mono from the pop and cork to the bait underneath. And the bait that hangs underneath can be almost anything. The cork is what draws the fish in. They hear this, they think it's a feeding fish. As they're coming up to it, whatever falls down in front of their face on the way to the cork is what they're going to eat. So it can be anything. This is just a DOA flat tail, gold with some glow on the bottom. But in general, you could be any soft bait. You could put a gulp shrimp on there, just anything on a jig head, just something with a little bit of weight that when you drop, after you pop the popping cork itself and it starts to settle in, you want that bait to fall behind it. So it just has to have some weight in it and something there, physical action, maybe some scent, whatever it is to see it come down, they're going to go after it and probably hit it. So something basic like that.
So when you're in your kayak and you eyeball a bait pod that you think is at least worthy of a couple of casts, like, what does that look like? Like, what ideally, and again, we don't always live in an ideal world, but ideally, how do you approach that bait pod, and then how do you present?
The first thing I do is figure out which way the wind and the drift are playing. So if obviously the Neuse River isn't tidal normally, so it's wind blown tide. So if I see a bait ball, I want to see it kind of uncomfortable. I want them skittish. I want to see them kind of popping together and kind of compact. If they're moving along fairly lazily, just rolling with the current, then there's not likely something massive scaring them, feeding on them, or in the immediate vicinity. If I see them tighten and you can tell they're nervous, and you see them popping where they're swimming too close to each other and they're really active, to me that's the goodness. That's what I want to see. So what I will do then is move out around them and try to not get too close, because I don't really want to spook them. I want to be as quiet as I can. And you can obviously be quieter in a kayak than you can in a boat, but you can still make a lot of noise in a kayak if you're not careful. So I ease around to where I'm upwind or up current, and then what I'll try to do is I'll turn off my trolling motor, and then I'll try to drift towards them. And as I drift towards them, then I'll start casting. And I won't cast directly in the middle, I'll cast towards the edges. That way I can have something that's near the bait ball, part of that scurry, but separate enough that hopefully the fish will see that and actually zone in on it.
So again, I'm going to follow in my mind, this ideal scenario. And so again, fishing on a kayak presents certain challenges. So ideally, do you want that hookup to come like directly off your bow? Do you want it to come a little bit more off your right side, a little bit more off your left side? Like for reaction, for comfort, for getting in position to fight, what's the best way for that kayak to be pointed in relationship to the bite?
I find it easier to be pointing towards it generally, and I'm right-handed, so I prefer my bite to be off the port side. So I will try to position myself so I can cast either towards the bow or slightly towards the port side, and then work the bait back towards me because it's more comfortable that way. And then if I hook up from there, it's where I expect it to be, and I know from there how to adjust. Basically, as it starts peeling line, I can then try to follow in behind it and try to keep the fish within the forward quadrant, if you will, of the kayak. It starts running around behind you, all of a sudden you're having to try to fight and deal with what you're dealing with. That's a lot harder to deal with on a kayak. And you have a much higher chance of getting tipped over that way.
What was again, I'm getting lost in thought, and I had this other question. So what was it, man? So fighting this drum, I guess what I was getting ready to ask is this. It's like when I'm popping corking and it's from a boat, it's not from a kayak. Like often my pop motion is more like waist height. Like I'm sort of pulling it across my body as opposed to popping it up, but I'm also standing up and I'm also in a boat. So how does your position so close to the water and sitting affect what you deem to be the most effective way to pop the popping cork?
What I've noticed, instead of having it quite so horizontal, like you're probably used to pulling it, basically waist height and kind of the rod pointing out directly from you, kind of horizontally, it'll have, for me, it tips up a little bit more, but the overall motion is basically the same. If you're using a 7'6" or fairly lengthy rod to use your popping cork on, then while sitting there holding it in the seated position, you still have enough clearance that if you don't have a lot of stuff sitting up in front of you on your kayak, then you can still work it just like you normally would. So it's just a slightly different angle. But the mechanics are basically the same. The way you pop it, the way you work the cork, that's all the same. It's the big difference is probably getting used to casting sitting down. That was a big transition for me. I was so used to fishing standing up that when I first got in a kayak, I felt like I was kind of confined. And then I've gotten used to maybe more side hand casts more than the overhand. As much, and that's really helped a lot, because now I'll roll up and side hand cast just as far as I would from the boat, and I can work it back to where comfortably with just basically my arms at my sides and just working the rod and reel as I would if I was standing on a boat. And I don't realize that I'm sitting down. I don't feel the difference anymore.
All right. So again, I'm going to preface this by saying this might be just a dumb kayak question, and I'm asking your forgiveness, which you have been very, friendly. So for me, like I don't kayak fish, but if I were to go out with you in August and we were to go big red drum fishing, popping cork, and whether we had success or not, we spent our time on the water. I got back to the dock. You predict what would be the most sore on someone like me who doesn't kayak fish very often?
It'll be one of two things. If you kayak, if you're used to being on your kayak but not fishing, so if it's a pedal kayak and you're used to pedaling it, then you'll be fine. With their legs, so to be your shoulder then from probably the popping action and just working that rod all day long. If you're not used to that, then the act of moving your kayak would be the most uncomfortable part. So if you're paddling, the motions in paddling, the shoulders and your back and muscles that you use to paddle, those will get you every time, regardless if you're bull red fishing or anything else. Paddling the kayak is a skill set that you have to develop, the muscles you have to develop with time, and that's just why I went lazy and went with the trolling motor.
All right, next question. And again, I said I wasn't going to preface anymore, so I'll just go right to it. Is it more of a challenge to get a strong hook set from a kayak as opposed to a boat where I just imagine you can give it a stronger hook set?
I haven't noticed a big difference, mostly because of braid, because the braid line doesn't have a lot of give, and the leaders I use are only a couple feet long. I don't have a lot of stretch there. So for me, I can get a really good hook set within maybe a foot and a half a throw of the rod tip. So it's not been a big issue. If I was fishing mono like I did when I was a kid, I think it'd be a much bigger deal, like when you bass fish and put in the big 3 or 4 foot swing of the rod tip to try to set that hook. It just hasn't been a big an issue. Well, that's one of the reasons I almost exclusively fish braid now, is because for other fish besides these bull drum, you can catch a fish just with you can just twitch your wrist and set the hook. It's pretty easy. So not a big change. I think just the mechanics of being on the kayak is probably the biggest adjustment. And once you're used to the kayak being there instead of the boat, the rest of the fishing stuff just becomes natural.
All right. So now let's say we've been working through this. We've found in my mind, we've found our bait. We've approached the bait. We've popping cork the bait. And now we just talked about the hook set. And man, now we are fortunate enough to have a big red drum on the line and we're in our kayak. So we don't want to be anchored. We do want to be anchored. What is, again, we could talk about ideal, but of course fishing is about obstacles and variables. Mm-hmm. So walk me through sort of like what it looks like ideally, and then what often an angler has to do because it's not ideal.
That's a great question because my philosophy differs based on the type of fishing. So if I was fishing for smaller fish, slot reds, or maybe just slightly over slot reds, then my default would be to shut off my motor if I was running it, pin the automatic power pole, and then raise my motor up, make sure everything's up out of the water, and just sit there and fight the fish from that one position. The trophy drum are so big and so powerful, and they make such long runs that I find it easier instead of anchoring. As long as everything is up, I just go for a ride. They basically call it like going for a sleigh ride. You're holding on and it's pulling you around. So I'd rather not be under an anchor, especially one that's overboard, like on the ground, like a claw anchor, and fighting the fish at the same time. If it's something I can pick up in a hurry, like the automatic power pole, then that's probably okay. And I may not rush to get it up immediately if I was pinned at the time I hooked up, but I wouldn't put it down if I hook up on a bull red. I would leave it up and let it pull me around to help tire it quicker. I want to get the fish to me, get it in, get the picture, get where I can get for it, if you will. A buddy of mine or a camera view, a video of it, get it back overboard, get it revived, and then get it swimming off again. The water's really hot this time of year, so those fish need some time to revive, and we want to keep those fish healthy. They're breeding stock for all of our redfish. So,
on the fight, on the sleigh ride, or on the pole, like, are these fish savvy enough to almost like intentionally change direction so that they're not? Because if you're pulling right off the bow, then that's your, like you've already said, that's your comfort zone. That's where you want to be. Do the reds pick up on that and try to get you out of your comfort zone, or I'm giving the red drum too much credit?
I've seen it go both ways. I've seen fish make one really long run, and when they get to the end of that run, they just get tired out and like, all right, I'm done. And you can kind of just reel them in. It won't be a problem at all. And I've seen other ones that act like that, and as you start reeling them in, they decide, oh, wait, I see your kayak now. I don't want to be anywhere near you, and then bolt directly underneath it wide open. So that's where not being anchored was a help, because you can kind of adjust to that. So the longer rod tip also helps if you can move it around the tip of the bow of the kayak itself so that your line doesn't get caught up underneath. So you do find yourself kind of playing this game of managing the rod and the line while the fish is doing what it wants to do. So get a good day, they just do the one run and you're done. But I've had them run crazy as well and have to spin me all around and just get dragged all over the place. It's a good time, but it's a little nerve-wracking especially if you want to get that one fish in. If it's the first fish of the day, it's when you don't want to lose. Once you've got one, the rest of them, that's just gravy. But that very first fish, I absolutely want to get that fish to the boat. And when it's running around crazy like that, that's the big stressor. It's like, nope, don't get off, don't spit the hook.
So my next question, and this might be more appropriate for slot red drum. I'm trying to go through my memory bank about big red drum, this detail. And it's like, I know for slot red drum, like they have their run or two, like you said, and then they see the boat. And then it's usually another run, at least one more run when they see the boat. Do you find that with the trophy red drum and the bull red drum, or usually they do their big stuff and by the time they get to you, it's a little bit of just a tug and battle, and it's not like another run when they see the kayak, which, is just less significant than a 24-foot bay boat. I don't know if they react the same.
Yeah, they still do the same kind of run sometimes. I mean, like I said, you have some that just come in and they just gave up, but there are the other ones that do see the kayak still and will run away. It's made worse if you are running like a trolling motor at the time, because the trolling motors do make noise, even though they're a lot quieter than an outboard. They still produce noise. So as you get the fish towards that, they may see that and either try to run around, or I've had some dive towards it. I don't know. I'm always curious. Are they smart enough to think if they can get in that prop, they can get away, if they can get the line caught up? Because I've seen some literally dive for the motor. So I get the habit of pulling my motor up now when I hook up, so I don't have that problem. But they definitely react. And when they react, it doesn't seem to be a repeat over and over and over. It's, you got the first run, you got that second or third run, and then they seem to calm down and you can get them to the boat.
All right. I think we're at the point where we wrap up with, again, your last point, safety considerations. We've touched on a couple, but I think I like, and I'll say this, like just about everyone I've ever had do kayak seminars at either fishing school, Wilmington or Moorhead, always sort of stresses the safety considerations, and they want to talk about that. And I applaud that. I mean, I think, again, that goes back to speak to the quality of the kayak fishing community and that they do take that serious. And so I'm happy to end our podcast with that. So we've touched on a couple, but in your mind, if we're going to finish with this, what are the safety considerations for the person to have in mind before they get all excited from this podcast and then head on out?
I'll say number one, above all else, absolutely wear a PFD. because of the way these fish are and they can be unpredictable, you don't want anything bad to happen in the water, get dumped out and not have your life vest on. I wear mine exclusively. I use an auto inflating style. You can use a regular style as well. They make kayak versions now that have the areas in the back that are recessed so you can sit comfortably in a kayak seat. But I would absolutely wear one of those no matter what, but especially when you're targeting big fish like this. That's super important. The other thing is definitely the weather. Middle of summer, storms can pop up out of anywhere. And you definitely, if you watch the weather at all, you realize a lot of those storms tend to follow the river. So if you're on the river fishing for these fish and a storm pops up, chances are really good it's going to hit that river and come at you. So planning for that and looking out for that weather while you're on the water is super key. And if I see anything sketchy coming, any lightning or any of the winds picking up, and I see some storm clouds heading my way, I'm usually headed back towards shore. I don't want to be out in the middle of the river or out in the middle of the sound for sure. If any of that weather comes up, you can get rolling 3-footers out there in a kayak. That's really, really dangerous.
All right. Well, I tell you what, Rod, this has been a great conversation. I feel like I'm smarter from this podcast, and I imagine other people are going to enjoy it too. And again, for everyone, this is Rod Olsen, Toadfish Mafia out of Carteret County, and you can, find Toadfish Mafia, what, social media or online?
Yeah.
What are
Facebook, Instagram. We're starting up a YouTube channel. It's a little slow going right now, but Instagram and Facebook, you can find us for sure. We've got our own website, and the Toadfish Mafia itself is just an open community to the public. We've got folks that get together, fish together. It's all about just that fellowship and having fun and enjoying the water and being passionate about fishing.
Well, man, it's been a pleasure. Been a pleasure talking to you in this podcast. I'm grateful that we found each other at the Moorhead Fishing School, and I imagine we have more rendezvous in our future. Rod, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, David, what do you think, man?
Man, I tell you what, I've got a to-do list now, Gary.
You have a to-do list.
I have a to-do list, and don't tell my wife that I'm going to do this, but I'm going to go out and get a stable, wide kayak, life vest, trolling motor, side scan sonar. Then I'm going to take it down to Dawson's Creek with the light wind and take it out around the ledges and look for some nervous bait balls with the popping cork. And
you're gonna you have $23,000 that your wife doesn't know about. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, that's so we're just it's just fun talk. Really.
If you are able to hide $23,000 from your wife, then I think we have another idea for a new podcast.
Another podcast,
because I would like to have that information.
I will let you know how it goes.
Yeah, man. There's so much to take away. Again, love to sort of help promote kayak fishing, even though I don't do it enough. I mean, maybe it's in my future, I don't know, but always enjoy those kayak fishing conversations. And Rod was a great guest.
Great. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this podcast. Just wanted to say thanks again to our sponsors, Port City Signs and Graphics and Marine Warehouse Center. And if you would like to become a part of the podcast, just call the Fisherman's Post Office and we'll hook you up.
Yeah, man. Again, Port City Signs and Graphics. Thank you, Sabrina. Marine Warehouse Center. Thank you, Emmett and Terrell. Oh, my God.
I know.
How come you didn't stop me?
Well, I didn't know if you had one.
Of course, Terrell called me. Of course, Terrell gave me a joke.
Okay, so we're going to end with a joke?
Yeah, we're going to end with it.
Let's end with the joke.
Moving forward, David Harden, it is your job to keep me in line.
All right.
Like I'm here yucking it up. And you're supposed to be the straight man that keeps me in my boundaries.
I didn't know if you had one, so I didn't say anything.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought it was bad news. The call started with bad news. I wasn't even sure it was a joke. He told me that Terrell called and said, "Hey, man, someone took my antidepressant pills." And then he said, "I hope they're happy."
Good one. That was good. Yeah, that was a good one.
Was it?
Yeah, that's good.
All right.
Good points for that.
Hey, everyone. If you've enjoyed this podcast, again, you want to support the podcast, we've got early podcast releases available. We got bonus podcast content available where we continue our conversation with Rod, for example, another 10 to 15 minutes after this, and weekly fishing reports, more fish library. But most of all, we appreciate you checking in. We appreciate your support. We appreciate the kind words about the podcast. I hope you can tell we certainly enjoy doing it.